Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Father William Neenan. I'm a Jesuit here at Boston College, and this is a marvelous crowd here tonight, and thank you for coming. I would like you to welcome to the continuing effort of Boston College to mount programs in its ongoing two-year program, as you know, the Church in the 21st Century. And this evening, we're privileged to have with us Professor Garry Wills. And I will have a few words to introduce Professor Wills in a moment, and he will be with you. He is one of the handful of leading public intellectuals in the United States, as you probably know, and one of even smaller handful of Catholic public intellectuals in the United States. After his presentation, he has agreed to entertain some questions and responses for a period of time, and following that, he's going to go across the room to the honors program where he will dynamically interact with some undergraduates, and you can go home. After Professor Wills received a PhD from Yale University in the classics, and he's gone on to a very distinguished academic and publishing career. He has taught at a number of universities, including Johns Hopkins, the University of Michigan, and Yale University Law Schools, and he currently is an adjunct professor of history at Northwestern, near his home in Evanston, Illinois. He has published nearly 24 books. Two of them have appeared on the Dean's List, I'm pleased to report, which I publish. He has received a number of distinguished awards, and I won't list them all, but the Pulitzer is one of them, the Presidential Medal of the Endowment for the Humanities, and he is the recipient of over 14 PhD honorary. As you entered, you may have noted the handsome rotunda if you're new to Boston College. Now, this is going back to a period where Professor Wills and I, in our lives, glancingly touched one another. If you haven't noticed it before on your way out, you may notice a panel right up there. There are 4 panels outside. You can't see them from here, but they're there. And one of them depicts Père Marquette, Jacques Marquette, the Jesuit explorer of the 17th century. Those of you who will think back to your American history, even if it was taken here on the eastern coast, you surely had Marquette and Joliet, the first white explorers of the Mississippi River. Well, this scene here depicts Père Marquette standing in a canoe. Now, those of you that are expert in canoe travel will know that if you stand in the front of a canoe, as Père Marquette is depicted as doing, he will do that for a brief 2 seconds. And the next second, he is flat on his face in the water. Now, actually, I am told, the rumor, and I am newly arrived at Boston College, but the panel to the right of Père Marquette standing in the canoe is a painting of Athanasius Kircher, the Jesuit polymath of the 17th century. And I am told that that covers up the depiction of Père Marquette face down in the water. Now, that is a metaphor, not face down in the water. But the second painting is a depiction of a metaphor of what I would describe one of the major aspects of Professor Wills' stunning presentation as a writer. He always, whether he's talking about Nixon, talking about Lincoln, Gettysburg Address, St. Augustine, any one of his numerous books, there is always a slant. There's always an approach that is new, invigorating, and opens up a new vista. So it's not head-on, standing head up in the canoe, but it's perhaps the second one that is not so popularly known. I'm looking forward very much this evening, and I want to ask you to welcome Professor Garry Wills as he discusses his topic, being a Catholic. Professor Wills.
Well, it's very good to be on a Jesuit campus. I spent most of my early life on Jesuit campuses to my much-needed improvement. In fact, I've spoken on 3 in the last 2 weeks. And everywhere I do that, I run into old friends like Bill, with whom I was in the seminary in St. Louis. Being a Catholic, I'm glad to talk about that subject too, because I have a number of people now who tell me that I should take it up, that I'm not one. In fact, I had a nice lady inform me by mail recently that I am the Antichrist. Bill Buckley said in the New York Times book review section that it's a matter of personal torment to him that I'm still in the church. Which is not the reason that I'm staying in the church. My hero, Gilbert Chesterton, when he was asked why he became a Catholic, said, "To have my sins forgiven." That's a good enough answer for me. That's why I am a Catholic, to have my sins forgiven. Scholars tell us that the forgiveness of sins in the Creed refers to baptism. When you were baptized in the early church, you had a period of penitence and instruction. And on Easter morning, you were stripped naked and stepped into a pool. And you were asked, "Do you believe in God the Father who made heaven and earth?" And you said yes, and were totally immersed. Then you were asked, "Do you believe in his Son who became man and suffered and died for us and rose again?" And you said yes, and you were totally immersed. And then you were asked, "Do you believe in the Holy Spirit who pervades the church?" And you said yes, and you were totally immersed. That's the Creed, the 3 professions of the Creed, slightly expanded, each of them slightly expanded in the Apostles' Creed of the 2nd century, and a little more expanded in the Nicene Creed of the 4th century. But that's what being a Christian means. The Didache, the early prayer manual of the church, said that you should say the Creed every day because it renews your baptismal professions. What that means is that the Spirit prays in us, in the whole church, through Christ to the Father, so that we are taken into the inmost dialogue of the inmost reality there is. Well, that's a pretty awing experience, good enough reason to be a Christian. And you would think that people who are taken into this tremendous experience would have a fairly wonderful organization. But we never did. The apostles squabbled. The primitive church was riven with faction in all of its centers, in Jerusalem, in Corinth, in Antioch, in Rome. At Antioch, Paul said to Peter, "You are a hypocrite and a turncoat." At Antioch, about 60 years later, Ignatius, the first bishop of Antioch, was driven out by his fellow Christians. Scholars now think that Peter and Paul were turned into Nero's executioners by their fellow Christians. So the church has never been a wonderfully pristine organization. And of course, it has perdured through horrible times, really terrible times. And it has picked up many of the attributes of those times. I was challenged when I said that As a general level of decency, the presidents of the United States score higher than the popes of the Catholic Church, which is not surprising. We haven't had presidents that I know of who were murderers, who were incestuous, who were torturers. We had all of those things in the popes because they lived through ruthless times when they were monarchs. And playing the monarch game then meant not only having armies and tax collectors and prisons and spies, but assassins and torturers. That was the game you played, and the popes played it. The church has, in its transit through sullied times, been misogynist in misogynist times, slaveholding in slaveholding times. Many popes held slaves. Anti-Semitic in anti-Semitic times. And why should we be surprised at that? Why should we expect to have a church that's better than Peter's and Paul's? The great saving truths have been preserved. The sacramental life has gone on. The graces of the Spirit have gone on all through these terrible times. And even at the worst of times. In the 10th century, the papacy was entirely owned by a theophylact family that put its own bastards in, which took all the money out and used it for its own purposes that had been collected from the church around. It was the very worst time, and yet at that time, the monastic revival of Europe took place and couldn't have taken place except out of Rome. The reformers could not have fought diocese by diocese, this metropolitan, that archbishop. They had to have a universal mandate out of Rome, and they did. The same thing happened with the mendicant reforms and the growth of the mendicants. Rome is a great center of teaching and hospitals and charities and bonds of unity with all kinds of people, but it has also been a place of great scandal and sin and corruption. So we should not be surprised at scandal. But people my age and Bill's age, in America especially, grew up with the idea that the church was really always perfect. It was always the same, never changed. It certainly shouldn't change. If you're perfect, why should you change? And if it did change, it would not be the church. Changelessness became the most important aspect of the Catholic Church. And a lot of non-Catholics admired that, especially in it. Malcolm Muggeridge used to say he loves that everything else switches around, but at least we can rely on the Catholic Church always to be the same. Well, thank God we can't. If we did, we would still have interdicts. We would still have the selling of indulgences. We would still have a pope saying that you can get out of purgatory by killing Albigensian heretics. We certainly did want to change those things, and we did. Nonetheless, a lot of people still think of the church as mainly relying on a claim to changelessness. I'd like to take 4 examples of that, ranging from the trivial to the more serious, and show that these changeless things were themselves the results of change, and what brought them in as a matter of change should have changed when the original motive was removed. The 4 things are fish on Friday, trivial, the Latin Mass, the celibate priesthood, and the male priesthood. Fish on Friday made sense. It came in as a medieval change. It was a monastic discipline that spread more widely, in which Friday was considered a kind of mini Good Friday every week, as Sunday was a mini Easter. And so you should fast the whole day from food and water. That was the ideal, and it was observed for a while, but as always happens, these terrible liberals come in and soften things up. And they said, well, you really don't have to fast every Friday. You don't have to fast all day, maybe just till nightfall, or maybe just from 12 to 3 when Jesus was supposed to be on the cross, or maybe just from this food, or maybe from that kind of drink. And it dwindled and dwindled down to it was fish. Eat fish, not meat. Can't eat meat on Friday, which was not a terrible penitential exercise for many Catholics in Europe because they couldn't afford meat on most days anyway. And people who know how to do it can turn fish into a great delicacy. My wife and I eat fish on Friday, every Friday, because we eat fish every day. And of course, anybody who objected, it's hard to remember now that people did object, could have eat fish on Friday on their own, obviously. Nobody was stopping them. But that was not what they wanted. They wanted to make other people do it, especially to make them do it under pain of sin. You know, Jesus said the Pharisees loved to bind great burdens on the backs of other people. Well, that was a trivial thing. The next example is the Latin Mass. Now, a lot of people were very upset when that changed, and some still are. But the Latin Mass was itself a change, and it changed by popular demand and by the demand for a vernacular. The Mass obviously didn't begin in Latin. It began in Aramaic. Jesus talked to his disciples in the language that they understood. And he didn't, at the Last Supper, say, now, I'm going to do something really important, so I'm going to get up and step over this little fence and turn my back on you and speak in a language you do not understand. And then you'll know that it's a mystery. Well, the Mass was said in Syrian, in Aramaic, in other things, but it was mainly said in Greek, because Greek was the most common language. It was the lingua franca of the Roman Empire. The language of the Roman Empire was not Latin. The empire had been inherited from the Alexander's Hellenistic Empire, where they spoke a kind of pidgin Greek, Koine Greek, and that's what the New Testament is written in, because it was the most common language. When Jesus and Pontius Pilate talked to each other, they spoke in Koine Greek, because Pilate didn't understand Aramaic and Jesus didn't understand Latin. When Peter went to Rome, like the other Jews of the diaspora, he would have spoken Koine Greek there, and that was spoken until enough of the native Italians became Christian, and they wanted to understand the Mass, and so it went into Latin, simply because it was the vernacular of those people. Only in that area, of course. It continued to be in Greek in the Greek Church and in parts of the Western Church for a long time. Well, by that logic, when Latin ceased to be the vernacular for most people, when it sprayed out into the Romance languages, into French and Italian and Spanish, it should have reverted to the vernacular. But by that time, there was a clerical elite that had a monopoly on learning, and Latin was the key to it. They not only said Mass in Latin and the office in Latin, but studied theology in Latin and read the Bible in Latin. And the Bible was not supposed to be translated into the vernaculars, according to the church at a certain point. Latin had become a shibboleth, just like fish on Friday. It was a thing that could never change. So at the Council of Trent, it was made the official Bible. Well, why would a translation be the official Bible and not the original languages? This is what was said. The Holy Spirit would not have allowed the church, by which they meant the Western Church, to use this for so many centuries if that's not the one he wanted us to use. And therefore, we have to stick to that. Well, of course, that crippled Catholic Bible scholarship for centuries, right down into this century. There's a kind of pathos to the story of poor Ronald Knox. The English Catholic Church came to him and said, we want a new translation of the Bible for our liturgy. And we want you to do it, but you have to do it from the Latin, from the Vulgate. So he spent years and years and years and translated. And by the time he finished, it had finally sunk into certain skulls that, no, a translation is not more authentic than the original languages, and any good liturgy would have to be based on the Hebrew original of the Old Testament and the Greek of the New Testament. So having commissioned it and used it for about a year, the English threw it out. But down to that very point, the spell of Latin had lasted. All right, go to the third thing, the celibate priesthood. That too was a change. For centuries, the priests and bishops married. In the 5th century, the holy poet Paulinus of Nola congratulated a bishop on having bishops for his son and his grandson. In the New Testament itself, Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 says, I have every right to travel with my Christian wife like Peter and the other apostles. When the pastoral epistles are written later on, it says the qualification for a bishop is to have a Christian wife. So the marriage of priests continued for a long time. What made it change? In the 4th century, there was an extraordinary movement, beautifully traced by Peter Brown, the scholar on late antiquity. A tremendous asceticism swept over both the East and the West, and pagan as well as Christian worlds, in which it was considered that the only way you could really get close to God was to divorce yourself, so far as possible, from the body entirely. Torture it to death, point, but not quite. Deprive it of sleep, deprive it of companionship, deprive it of food, of drink, of sex, of marriage. These people became great celebrities. Peter Brown says they were the astronauts of their time, exploring outer space. And people went to them to be consulted, to consult. Simeon Stylites could write treaties for countries. Athanasius in Alexandria was very upset at this, and he said, we've got to ordain some of these people so that their holiness will rub off on us. But they didn't want to be ordained. He kept after one man, and he sent back an ear that he'd cut off. And he said, if you keep this up, I'll just keep sending back body parts, because denying the body is getting close to God anyway. John Chrysostom wanted to become a desert father. He went into the desert, and his health broke, and he almost died, so he had to come back and settle for second best, which was priesthood. And so then, in order to regain credibility and authenticity with the people, it was decided they should become ascetics themselves, not only not marrying, but adopting much of the other programs, scourging themselves, fasting, and letting people know that they do that. And so incrementally, this came in as a way of gaining the trust and honor of people. Well, that original motive has largely evaporated. We don't see too many desert fathers in the priesthood these days who starve themselves to the point of death or scourge themselves. So we have to come up with some new arguments for saying that the church can't change on this. And Paul VI did in his encyclical on the celibate priesthood. Now, he went to Scripture, but only part of it. He left out the most relevant passage of all, the passage where Paul says, I can travel with a Christian wife like Peter. That never appears in the encyclical. It's the most relevant passage. The subtitle to my book before this, Papal Sin, was Structures of Deceit, and that's what I meant by it. Paul VI did not lie directly. He didn't say, Paul didn't say that. It's not in Scripture. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't apply. He just left it out to deceive us. Well, what did he find in Scripture? The one he loves, that he uses 4 times in the encyclical, 4 separate times, is the passage that says, some people are born castrated, some people are castrated by force by others, and some people castrate themselves for the kingdom of heaven. Now, there are certain problems with that use of that passage. For one thing, it's not said about priests. He says it to the whole of the Christian audience listening to him. He doesn't specify that that's about priests for a very good reason. There are no priests in the New Testament. The word hieros only occurs in 2 places. Once in the book of Revelation, where all of those who rise will be priests around the altar of God, and in the Epistle of Hebrews, where it's said that Jesus is the last priest. Paul lists over a dozen ministries: healers, teachers, readers, overseers, suppliers, speakers in tongues, interpreters of tongues, etc., etc., etc. Never says priest, never calls himself one, never calls Timothy one, never calls anybody he addresses as one, never says that he presides over the Eucharist. It wasn't there. What he says is all of these gifts are given by the Spirit, and you take them up as the Spirit moves. It was a charismatic community. Well, we know from charismatic communities that sooner or later, usually quite soon, you have to have a little more structure. You have to have people who regularly do certain things. And so the priesthood developed. It was a development, a natural, legitimate, important development. But Jesus wasn't talking to priests when he said that about castration. Also, the Pope didn't look at the parallel passages. This is part of a series of things that say, for instance, if your right eye offend you, pluck it out. That's like castration. If your right hand, the official, ritual, important hand in Jewish thought, offend you, cut it off. If your foot offend you, cut it off. If your family gets in the way, hate your father, hate your mother. These so-called kingdom sayings are signaling the tremendous break in history that Jesus is bringing. But it has nothing to do with the priesthood. Nothing at all, unless you're going to consider all Christians as priests, as the first epistle of Peter did, but not an ordained order within the priesthood. Well, then Paul came up with Paul VI, that is, another argument, that if you are married, you will have more concern for your wife and child and not as much concern for your flock. So in order to be a good priest and think of the community, you should not be married. Now, I don't know if that's your experience. Does a spouse separate you from others? In my case, my wife reminds me very pointedly of people I would otherwise not notice or neglect or misunderstand. And she tells me, when I do misunderstand them, how I misunderstand them. And does having children get in the way? When our children were growing up, playing with other children, and we were interacting with their parents at church, at school, at Little League, at choir, at ballet, we were never more involved with the community, and we never had a wider network or closer network of friends. To this day, they remain our closest friends. I think it's kind of insulting to say that a family cuts you off from other people. Families are exercises in community, intermeshing with community. When you go to a doctor, do you say, I want a good prescription for my child, but I must find out first if you have a child of your own, because if you do, you might not care as much about my child. Doesn't it work the other way? Certainly we should say to anyone running for president, you're going to have hundreds and hundreds of millions of people to take care of. We can't fritter away your time with a wife and children. So only bachelors should run for president. Now, if that's true, then this would not be true. If a bishop had a wife and their son was raped by a priest, do you think that bishop would move that priest around and not tell other people that their children are at risk? Do you think that he would try to keep him from the civil authorities? Do you think he would reassign him decade after decade while 70, 80 other children were molested? Do you think his wife would let him? The fourth thing I want to consider is the male priesthood. Now, we're told Jesus didn't ordain any women. Quite true. But he didn't ordain any men. The priesthood was a development, an early natural development. It took place at a time when everybody, and I mean everybody, pagan, Jewish, Christian, all were agreed that women were inferior. Aristotle said that nature tries to make a man, and when it fails, it's a woman. St. Thomas Aquinas repeated that in the 13th century and said that's why women can't be priests. God deserves the best, and they're second best. Now, the only reason why they were kept out was for that. It was natural at a time when authority seemed to be male, to have only male authorities in the church. But when that changed, when, as we know, they're superior, not inferior, that applies no longer. There's no reason why a woman cannot be a priest. In fact, I have interviewed Sister Prejean, who does work on death row, and is a pastor through a terrible, harrowing time for people, is the real Christ to those prisoners. Isn't it a little ridiculous that having gone through that, she has to call in a stranger at the end to give the last rites? Who is the real pastor in that case? This is very meaningful to me because I've been going for 22 years to a campus church at Northwestern University. And for 17 of those years, the thread of continuity was a woman called Mary Kincaid Kissinger. She was originally called a chaplain, and then the diocese got a little upset at that, so she was called the assistant director. In that time, 3 priests came and went, and in the interstices, she had to pull people in to do the sacraments the way Sister Prejean had to pull people in. But she was the one who was the heart of the community, who was the one that especially the students loved. She ran retreats, she ran prayer groups, she ran meditation groups. She would memorize every year all of the people who were coming in that year at Northwestern who had put check Catholic on their entry form. She would memorize their names and something about them. And when they came in, she would say, "Oh, thank God that you came, Mary from so-and-so. We've been waiting for you." She said, these are people who are, many of them, leaving their parents' parish for the first time. They're facing an intimidating new stage of their life. They don't know what role religion will play in it. And so we have to go out toward them. Well, she retired in May, and the students organized the farewell to her, which took place after Mass. About 24 students, present and from before, who came back, including some married couples who came back, who had had their instruction from her, would get up at various points in the church and tell their story of what she had meant to their life. And each of them had a long-stemmed rose and would go over and give it to her at the end of their presentation. So she ended with 24 or so long-stemmed roses. We never did that for any of the priests. And the interesting thing about Mary is that she's Kincaid Kissinger because her first husband died in that 17-year period, and we all grieved with her as a community. And she found a second husband in the community, and we all rejoiced with her. And she has 8 children, 18 grandchildren, and I forget how many great-grandchildren, but they never got in the way of her closeness to us at all. Quite the opposite. The priesthood is disappearing at a terrible, terrible rate. Most people don't know because it's happening mainly in the developing countries, where they are a fifth lower. They have 1/5 of the number of priests proportion to people that we have in the West. So we need women, and they are stepping in. There are more lay ministers in America now than priests, and 85% of those are women. And they're doing what Mary Kincaid Kissinger does. They're in hospitals, they're in prisons, they're in universities. So we need them just on a practical level, but we need them on a theological level. The priesthood was male because all authoritative imagery was male. And so we made God male. God is not male. God is not gendered. He's beyond gender. He's a mystery. St. Augustine said, if it's God, you don't understand it. If you understand it, it's not God. And he said, the Father is not really the Father in any literal sense at all. The Son is not really the Son. He said, we use this analogy because it's what God gave us in the Incarnation. It gets us close to the mystery, but it doesn't state it in any literal form. But in getting us closer to the mystery, it gets us farther off if we think of God not only as gendered, but as unigendered. That God is only male. That God created only males to be his image. That was the medieval view, you know. Man was the image of God, and woman was the image of man. No, it doesn't work that way. We're all the image of God. So we should think of God as transcending gender, as having certain aspects that we want to find in the highest reality that are male, but certain aspects that are female as well. So though we have to call him God the Father and God the Son, God the Holy Spirit is not unigendered. I'm sure that she's female, and that she's the one who will guide us into being Catholic in the future years, following a future that is marked out for us by Mary Kincaid Kissinger. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.
Gary's pouring some gin here right now.
He knows me too well.
Thank you, Gary. I think that's Père Marquette face down in the water, maybe. Gary has graciously agreed to entertain comments, reflections, and questions. And we have a number of people. This is one with a portable microphone. There may be two. This is the power structure of the undergraduate student government here. So please, I'm going to go back to my seat before it's taken. And then Gary will respond to your questions. And then at a certain point, I'm going to reappear, and I'm going to tell you to leave. All right? Gary, it's all yours.
So, any hands? Then yeah, right here.
Probably don't need a mic.
No, that you do.
Says it's on. No, I'm going to stand up.
Okay.
No. Mic's not working. My question is, what hope do you see for the future? It's a rather large question.
Question is, what hope do I see for the future? I see a huge hope. I think that after a time of stagnation of the wonderfully important developments of the Second Vatican Council, there is now a regeneration of determination. For 30 years, most Catholics, and I mean a high number, have not agreed with the Vatican on a whole range of issues. And they've not felt disturbed in their conscience. They are convinced that they are good Catholics. They go to communion. They have an active sacramental life, a prayer life, a life of charity toward other Christians. But they were just willing to go along and pay no attention to the disagreements. Well, that's all right if you're just disagreeing on contraception, say, as about 93% of Catholics under 40 do. But when the members of the mystical body of Christ are being brutally assaulted by their supposed Christian caretakers, it's not enough just to go along passively. And people are aware of that. They're rising up and doing something about it. 96% of Catholics answered a Zogby poll saying, should the bishops who covered this up be punished? 96% said yes. Now imagine that. That's old and young. It's left and right. It's as close to unanimity as you'll ever get in the Catholic Church. The bishops, when they met in Dallas, had never been addressed by lay persons in a public forum. 7 got up on television and for hour after hour told them, you're unaccountable, you're secretive, you're remote, you're corrupt, you're unresponsive to us, and they had to sit there and take it. When the debate followed and the Charter for the Protection of Children was being discussed, a number of people rose to soften that in one way or another. And bishop after bishop got up and said, we can't do it, the people won't let us. They're scared, as they well should be. And they realize they have to be accountable. They do, and we realize it also. We've all grown up, I suppose, being told the church is not a democracy. Well, it's not, in the sense that we're not going to vote tomorrow on the number of persons in the Trinity. The creed is not up for plebiscite. But the church began as a democracy. Bishops and priests were elected in the early days. They were elected in Venice right down into the 17th century. They were not only elected, they were dismissed, and they were given their terms of service. When Augustine was approached in Hippo to be a bishop, he said, I don't want to be a bishop, that's not my calling. I'm supposed to be a scholar monk. And they said, too bad. People of God are telling you what you should do. And so he had to become a bishop. When he did, if he wanted to go to a council in Carthage, if he wanted to take a week off from his daily sitting and mediation with his flock, he would ask their permission. And if they didn't give it, he couldn't go. Ambrose, about 15 years earlier, was in Milan, and the people said, we want you for a bishop. And he said, I can't be your bishop. I'm not even baptized. And he said, besides, I serve the emperor, and the emperor won't let me go. And they said, we'll see about that. And they went to the emperor, who was just down the street in Milan. And they said, we want him for the church. And he said, okay, you can have him. And so he had to go. So there's nothing in the structure of the faith that demands a monarchy. The monarchy came along in the Middle Ages when that was the received form of legitimacy, just as the male priesthood was the received form of legitimacy in the early centuries, so the monarchy later. Now that's no longer a thing that is self-evidently valid. Now we want accountability, and we're going to get it. Got one? No, yeah, let's go this side first.
I guess related to that, would you describe a bit about the origin of papal infallibility and what your thoughts are about that and the implications for being Catholic today?
Yes, papal infallibility is the great theological red herring. It was defined only in 1870. It's been used only once since on a non-controversial matter. John Henry Newman said at the time of its definition, it's such a weird weapon it will never be used. Well, it was used once for the Assumption of the Virgin. Well, there were churches of the Assumption, there were thousands and thousands of paintings of the Assumption, prayers to the Assumption, fourth decade of the glorious mysteries was the Assumption. It didn't change our prayer life or our beliefs at all. It was just a way that Pius XII could say in 1954, see, it can be used. Doesn't matter, but it can be used. Now you think to yourself, what difference to your belief, your prayer life, your attitude toward others has papal infallibility ever meant to you? Papal infallibility didn't give us the creed, didn't give us the canon of Scripture, didn't give us the doctrines of the Incarnation. All those took place in the first, second, fourth, third, fourth centuries before the Pope had any kind of teaching stature. The great councils were held without any Pope attending. They were held in Greek, so the legates that he sent couldn't understand what was being debated. Papal infallibility was pushed through by Pius IX at a time when he thought the whole world was against him and the whole church was falling apart because it had taken away his kingdom. So it had a kind of compensatory satisfaction for him. But look at the terms of it. What it says is the infallibility that Christ wanted for his church can be exercised by the Pope alone when speaking ex cathedra on matters of faith and morals. Now, most people talk only about those later provisions. But the really key one is the first one. He can't do anything alone if it's not what the Christ wanted for the infallibility for his church. So papal infallibility is used as a barrier against other Christians. It's used to kind of bully Catholics into thinking, well, we've got to obey the Pope even when he's not being infallible. The whole point of the infallibility exercise was to limit that off, to define it very clearly as not what he's normally talking about. So it's a great irrelevancy. To talk about it is to do damage to the credibility of the church. You know, that's what the enemies of the church say. Oh, you know, who can believe in one man being infallible? There are tremendous interfaith activities going on with the Eastern Church, with the Lutherans, with the Episcopalians. The Lutheran delegation and the Catholic delegation have come out with a joint statement on justification that removes all of the real theological problems of the Reformation. But everybody keeps bringing up papal infallibility, saying, well, they won't accept that. Well, of course they won't, except if they realize that it doesn't mean much. So it's an irrelevancy. None of you in this room has ever prayed in a different way because of papal infallibility. Yes? Is there a mic? No, we need.
I would like to say about 75% of what I heard so far, in my opinion, about 75% of what I heard tonight is wrong. In my opinion, I respectfully say that to you. I know I'm not going to be accepted in this particular room with that statement, but I would like to talk about four things that you brought up.
Okay, remember this is a question period.
Okay. You said fish on Friday. That was no more than an exercise of the will. Am I not correct? That exercise was not exercise.
It was an irrelevancy. It was not real penance.
Latin Mass, the Mass of the vernacular, there's nothing really wrong with that. It's just that most people are not learned enough now. They don't study Latin in many of the colleges. So the vernacular is really what someone should know.
Right, understandable. That's the argument for the vernacular. Yeah.
Celibacy is very important, in my opinion, because what celibacy addresses is not to keep a man away from a woman. It's to keep interiorly that person for Christ.
Okay, then everybody has that goal, not just a priest.
And four, there was a time in the past when a female, quote-unquote, priest was swallowed up in the earth. Remember that verse? That's one. Two.
Give me the citation. What? Give me the verse of that citation.
Okay, and in Leviticus, there were three who went against Aaron and they went against Moses. And what was the outcome of their situation?
The woman wasn't a priest, by the way. It's not a parallel.
Most of the stuff I have in the book in my bag, Papal Sin, is disgusting.
Is that a question?
The question really is that in a recent conservative magazine that I started to get, they had a story, a little review of your book. And in it, the author, Mr. Zamara, called you an apostate. Would you call yourself an apostate?
No, there are many other people who are doing it for me. I don't have to. It's amazing, in fact, how many popes there are, because I seem to be getting papal condemnations from all kinds of people that don't live in Rome. We should go back to the woman back here. Can you rush one back to her?
I'll try to be relevant. What do you see as the need for the papacy to continue in order for us to remain Catholic? Do you see a connection there that do we need the papacy to be Catholic?
Do we need a papacy to be Catholic? By the way, in that poll, the most extensive poll done of under 40s Catholics, 800 long interviews and a group of focus groups, etc. The Lilly Foundation did it. It asked, what is essential to Catholicism? And it said works of charity, and that was like 70%. The Trinity, that was 85%, and so on. And it said the papacy, and it was 48%. It was a minority position for Catholics under 40. I don't agree with that minority at all. Of course we need the Pope. The symbol of Peter is very important in the gospel. He's the first of the apostles. He's the one that Jesus says, "Feed my flock." As I mentioned earlier, even in the 10th century, it was a great bond of unity. It's been a great power of regeneration. And other religions, when we do unite, as I think we will, I think, recognize that the execution site of Peter is the central spot of Western Christianity, where we will all gather someday. So the Pope is an important part of Catholic history and theology. On the other hand, he's not the head of the church. The mystical body has only one head. It's Christ's body. Christ is the head. He's an important member of the church. He's not one that is always right. In fact, Newman said in the 4th century, most of the hierarchy and Pope Liberius became Arians at a time when the laity remained Orthodox. He said the church is like a triangle. Sometimes it rests on one side, sometimes it rests on the other. That doesn't mean the other two sides are ever not connected, not there, not important, not structural. It just means that sometimes the Spirit works through other parts of the church and sometimes through this. The laity, it's not enough to say the papacy has often been wrong. The laity have been terribly, terribly wrong over and over and over. Most of the real scandals of the church, Jewish pogroms, burning of witches, that kind of stuff, started as a popular lynch mood in the laity. And it was the authorities in the church that normally checked and restrained that. So we all need each other. And we're not trying to withdraw from any part of the church. We're trying to help it, to support it, to make it sustainable. When certain things in the papacy documents become incredible, we don't do him a service by believing them. We do him a service by continuing to love and need him and saying, it's unreasonable to tell people that a teaching in natural law is not reached by anybody outside the church, certainly, who should be able to reach it in natural law. They have natural reason, they have goodwill, and not even by 98% of your own Catholics. What do you say at that point? The only way to be a good Catholic is to believe the unbelievable? The only way to be a good Catholic is to check your brains at the door? I don't believe that. I don't think any of you do. I want to scatter it around. Anybody over there? Okay, here.
I just had a question regarding the future of the church. Right now, the power of the church is so centralized in Rome. How would you see, envision for the future, how we would have both the primacy of the Pope and the significance of the local level, so that you really have a world church?
Mm-hmm.
Bureaucrats in Rome don't tell the church in India,
Yeah.
or Sri Lanka, or Boston.
How do we decentralize the church? Well, we started to do it at the Second Vatican Council. There it was said that synods of bishops would be important, that local groups would be important, that laity would be consulted, all those things which didn't happen. They began to happen. But in trying to check those developments, the papacy put itself in an unsustainable position. Here's what happened. When national conferences of bishops began to discuss things that Rome didn't want them to discuss, or when synods did in Rome, they took away the powers of those groups. They had no right to do that. National conferences of bishops have been very important in the history of the church, most recently in Poland, when the Pope was then the cardinal running that national conference. The National Conference of African Bishops overrode Pope Zosimus on the Pelagian issue. Augustine and Alypius and others did. They're very important in the history of the church. Here's what happened. When Holland and other places, Latin America, started talking about liberation theology, started talking about Catholic married priests, the Pope issued a motu proprio in 1998 called Apostolos Suos. He said that no national conference can do anything, make any binding motion, except under two conditions. It has to be unanimously voted, which no council has ever done. What that meant is that one conservative bishop complaining to Cardinal Ratzinger could veto the whole nation's attitude. And the second condition, it's approved by Rome. Well, that made the bishops impotent. And it's happened over and over. The bishops try to come up with a statement on women. The bishops have had the liturgy taken away from them. They've had the running of universities challenged. They've had the running of seminaries taken away from them. Do you think they don't resent that? You bet they do. And one of the proofs was in Dallas. They knew going into Dallas that some people were going to vote against some action on this scandal. 13, in fact, did. Well, that would instantly have made the whole thing invalid. So they invented a whole new instrument, the charter. You never heard the word charter before. It's brand new. And it was they said, this is not binding. This is not law. This is a voluntary agreement, diocese by diocese. We would do it just on our own hook. It's a gentleman's agreement. Well, what that meant is that it didn't have to go to Rome. It was not binding. It went into effect immediately, and Governor Keating was produced like a rabbit out of a hat at the end of the last session to say, I'm here, it's active, it's functioning. What they had to do was send to Rome the norms. And the norms said, we don't think any of this is against the spirit of canon law, but if it is, you can tell us. But they realized by the time they told them it's going to be in effect for 4 months or so. After all, it was summer in Rome when it was sent over there. Nothing happens in summer in Rome. So they took a very nervy step. They circumvented Rome. Now, Rome's trying to rein them in again, but it's going to be very hard. I'm hearing some rumors that it's not going to be very successful. But the minute this Pope dies, there are many, many resentments, many, there are a lot of bishops and cardinals who resent the fact that the Pope has showered favors on a small set of people. Opus Dei, Comunione, Liberazione, Legionaries of Christ, Focolare. They're very tiny groups in proportion to the whole of Catholic. They've been given all kinds of special privilege because they're the only people he can find who will agree with everything that he says. But they're very resented by many bishops and many cardinals who can't do much about it at the moment. But when this Pope dies, there's a lot of pent-up activity, resentment, hope, aspiration. I think the changes that took place under John the 23rd may look like small potatoes next to what is about to happen.
Close it down. What? Close it down now?
Yeah, don't forget signing.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Gary. Two little brief announcements, and then I would like to say something in closing, if I may. Professor Wills is willing to sign copies of his book in the rotunda just opposite the standing Père Marquette. And the students that are here will be meeting with Professor Wills in the Honors Library across the rotunda. Now, before you go your various ways, I want to, on behalf of Boston College, to thank you for coming here. This is another in the ongoing programs that the university is sponsoring, the church in the 21st century. And I just want to say that as a Jesuit, I am proud that this university has undertaken this initiative. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. If my mother were living, she would be proud of that ovation. Thank you. I would like to reflect just a moment on this marvelous exchange and this outpouring of presence here tonight. I've been a Jesuit for many, many years. Garry Wills and I both did our philosophy training at St. Louis U. It was called Missouri River Thomism that we drank at in those days. And I've been at Boston College now 20 years, and I've been Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and Academic Vice President, and now I have a marvelous job called Vice President and Special Assistant to the President. Don't ask me what it is, and I'm not going to tell you. But and part of my task is to go around the country and talk about Boston College and to encourage alumni and others to contribute to BC and so forth. I make the statement, and I'm going to expand on it in just a minute. People will say, many alumni and others will say, they haven't seen the university, they will say, now is BC, is it still Catholic? Is it still Catholic? And I will make the statement, and I'm going to expand on it in just a moment if I can have your attention. I said it's more Catholic and Jesuit now than it's ever been in its history. And I picked 3 times, 1950, 1970, the year 2000. I was a young man from Sioux City, Iowa, went to St. Louis U in 1950. And probably similar, I wasn't even aware of Boston College in those days, but probably very similar to BC. A lot of my classmates were Catholic, a lot of the faculty were Jesuits. It was sort of the air we breathed. It was a great place, but we didn't reflect on it a lot. It was the air we breathed. Then it was 1970. I was teaching at the University of Michigan at the time. There was a lot of institutionalism abroad against the government, against families, against church, etc., and I suspect BC shared in that. To be a Jesuit in the year 2000 at Boston College is to have died and gone to heaven. Everything good that happens, if you recycle, if you don't litter, etc., these are Jesuit values. The young men and women are at Boston College now are really not taken up with some of the issues that those of my age and your age, and many of you, are concerned about. They're concerned about the things that Professor Wills talked about. Forgiveness, love, belief in God, prayer, the Eucharist, some of the basic things. Some of the clutter that we went through in our younger days are really non-issues today for the young men and women at BC. And they are eager to drink at the wells of the Catholicism that is springing up here at this university. So I just want to share that with you and say this is another manifestation, I think, that this is a very Jesuit and Catholic university. Thank you for coming. Thank you. And I hope to see you at the next